All right. So in Bash and other Linux, terminal connection tools, we have the ability to run commands on multiple servers at the same time. So our ad hoc commands aren't much different than that. It's a way for us to test our connections to our servers and run any of the built-in modules. It is a very slick tool. Um, it is definitely useful, but it's not as useful as writing playbooks or using roles. So, for example, um, not to call Bill out, but Bill will connect to dozens and dozens of hosts in a single terminal window, and he'll sync all of them up, and he'll run a command, or he'll go from terminal window to terminal window, and it's literally what I have nightmares about. um my brain isn't ever going to be that talented to manage that many open terminals at the same time, or fractions of a terminal window. If I wanted to run, just an update on all of my servers, or if I wanted to reboot all my servers, I can use something as easy as a one-liner with Ansible. Um, Typically, you're not going to use this for an enterprise setting. You probably want to do more than just hit the reboot switch on all of your servers, but this is very powerful if you want to leverage it this way. My second example, after the ping module, I do not specify a module at all. And I wanted to highlight that the default module is the command module. So right now I'm just saying just use the command sbin reboot. The F flag is also really awesome. F is for fork. Forking is the way that Ansible talks about concurrency. So by default, Ansible allows you to run, work with 5 servers at the same time, just to make everything a little bit faster. When you change that number, you can make Ansible run even faster. So this is forking for 10 servers at the same time. And then lastly, the that should have been dash dash ask password. That's definitely a typo. The ask password, so you don't have to store your SSH password. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide or two. There is also a command called Ansible console. This drops you into a nice little shell and allows you to write these commands even simpler. I'm going to demo that in a little bit. But this is where you want to start when you're playing with Ansible. All right. So Ansible has plenty of options for connecting, but you're typically going to interact with your hosts over SSH. The only exception are Windows hosts. We are not going to talk about Windows hosts. There are many people in the Ansible community committed to getting, connecting the Windows hosts and configuring it with Ansible. I don't think it's quite ready yet, but there are definitely certain things that have been worked on extensively. So check out the documents for the documentation for all that stuff, but I'm not going to talk about Windows stuff. So as you saw earlier, I'm using SSH keys. Bill Stearns has a great presentation. The link's also in my code for his talk on SSH without passwords. It is fantastic. It's going to get you up and running very quick, and hopefully not just with Ansible. Bill's talk is going to help you figure out connecting to your devices a little bit better and easier. If you're using passwords, and passwords are completely fine for a home lab and non-production stuff, in my opinion. If you're just doing that, you can use the dash dash ask pass. So you're not storing passwords. This is where I say, hey, please do not store passwords, unencrypted passwords in your Ansible code. There are many of us that are looking at GitHub repos of Ansible code, and we're looking for credentials. Everything's written. It's very difficult to hide this stuff. The only exception is if you're vaulting it. Now, Ansible has a built-in feature called Ansible Vault, where you can vault passwords or keys, and you can store your credentials safely that way. I'd look into it if that's the way that you want to go. But SSH keys are just really easy, and it makes your life a lot simpler. Don't store passwords unencrypted on GitHub, please. All right. Um, Privilege escalation. So there are a lot of people that will just log into a Linux host as root. Depending on your security model, I'm sure that's fine for what you're doing. However, when you're sharing that machine with multiple different people, when you have different groups using that machine, you certainly don't want to give everybody root access, right? Your administrators need root access. Your developers definitely don't need root access. And your managers probably shouldn't be logging into your hosts at all. But there's definitely different groups that need different levels of access to our hosts. So Ansible is a configuration management tool, and in most instances, we're going to need to give it advanced access to interact with processes that require root. So there's ability to use privilege escalation. So um, the become keyword, we're going to talk about variables in a little bit and where to shove them into your playbooks. Become is talking about privilege escalation. So there's different ways of doing that. I always recommend using sudo and not switching user, but there are options for you. And I would always recommend using the least privilege. Okay, so now we're going to talk about playbooks. So I'm just going to quickly mention YAML and JSON. So YAML is yet another markup language. We have everything on the left. I want to make sure that we are. I want to make sure that we are talking specifically about how how to read YAML and how to write YAML. YAML is very flexible and it's very easy. As you can see at the top where Do and Ray, strings are just, regular double quotes. Just a really easy, normal way Python handles it. JSON handles it, but we don't need that comma afterwards, right? JSON treats everything like it's a big array. You don't have to worry about that with YAML. Your lines are independent of each other. The same thing, they both basically handle floating point numbers like you can see with Pi, Booleans. Quick note on Booleans, they both use lowercase t's, where you have a lot of different languages that use uppercase t's or uppercase f's for true or false. Regular integer is just stored as an integer. And then arrays are a little interesting. So this is what in YAML we call an extended array for calling birds. But you could also store it on a single line in square brackets. But I recommend you have the space, just expand it out. It's just a lot easier to read. And then lastly, as I complained about before, YAML allows you to group things together in if you wanted like a list of an array of other elements by indenting. So the indent level tells you that all of these elements are part of Xmas fifth day, just like this JSON group. So it's it's pretty intuitive. It's pretty easy to read. And linting is very easy and inexpensive. So definitely use. I'm gonna show off the Ansible lint tool later. But if you're using VS Code or you're using another editor, just YAML linting makes it very easy to make sure you're not making just mistakes on your syntax. Hey, Bill, how are we doing? Any questions? Do we have any questions or? Can people still hear me? Am I still online?
Doing pretty well. We've had some side questions about Windows, and we've talked about those on the chat channel. There was a reference to Salt and why you would pick Ansible versus Salt, one or the other. Any opinion on that? It's been so long since I've used Salt.
Yeah, I certainly do. I'll just address it real quick. Ansible, I just think is easier to read. We're gonna show off some playbooks in a second. There's nothing wrong with if you have the domain knowledge in Salt already. Salt is definitely older than Ansible at this point. If you have the domain knowledge and that's your comfort level, then that's fantastic. But a lot of these older languages have domain specific languages and, you know, weird, interesting syntax, and you cannot abstract them as easily as Ansible. So I like Ansible better, but if there is a if you already have domain knowledge in another tool like Salt, that's perfectly fine. Just remember, it's not quite as popular anymore. So you're gonna have to train your team if you're using this at work. You're gonna have to train your team to use it. Ansible probably has more resources out there. I don't think I've ever tried to quantify that, but if you're on YouTube or another like learning type platform, you're probably going to see a lot more Ansible videos and more blogs about how to properly use Ansible, because just Salt is a little bit older and unfortunately a little bit less modern than some of the newer ones like HashiCorp's Terraform and Vagrant and Red Hat's Ansible. So hopefully
Thank you,
that answered
David.
your question.
Yep. Thank you very much.
No problem. All right, I'm going to continue, and Bill, please interrupt me if there is more questions.
You got it.
All right. So this isn't exactly the meat and potatoes, but this is one of the things that makes Ansible so powerful. As you can see, these are all very, very easy to read. So without me explaining what this specific playbook does, it's very easy to figure out what's going on. So the playbooks are in YAML. So we start with the 3 dashes, and then our playbook starts with us telling, what is the name of the playbook, what hosts are going to be affected, and what hosts are going to be logged into and configured, and then we have some connection variables. So we can do things like what remote users we're going to use if that's not configured in the defaults. That's not configured in the defaults. Things like become that we talked about, privilege escalation, and any other variables that we need to stuff in there. And then we come with tasks. So it's I try to illustrate this as best as I can, but we're indenting all of this stuff. So you can see that the top block is indented a little bit is all the way to the left, and then each task is indented underneath task. Each task is a step. So we can use different built-in modules or roles here, and we can accomplish something. So how it typically works is you have a name, you name it in something that describes what's happening, and then we have our the name of our module. So strictly, the Ansible.builtin keywords are not needed. If you just put yum here, it would work. However, the best practices always say to use Ansible built-in. So we know that these are built-in modules instead of something that you imported or took from a local source. And then we have the variables for those modules listed underneath. And then we can put as many tasks together as we want. And that's one of the really powerful things about playbooks is, we're literally putting in, we're literally making a really readable list of tasks that we're going to accomplish on specific hosts. And we'll talk a little bit more about that during the demos. But the big difference between a playbook and a role is a role is going to have could have multiple playbooks. It could restrict things to only operate for certain operating systems. So you might have playbooks specific for Debian compared to, um, Red Hat or CentOS, or specific things for Ubuntu versus Debian, or whatever the operating system is. And then you're also going to have all of your default variables stuffed in there. So a playbook is a single file, where a role or collection is going to be multiple folders and files, that are kind of abstracted together. So if you are going to, and I'm going to talk more about a strategy of doing this for a entire network, but if you are going to run Ansible across your network to configure an entire environment, you wouldn't want just one file with, hundreds and hundreds of tasks. That would just be unmaintainable. You'd want to abstract things into roles, and you'd want to probably have multiple inventories. So you have probably one inventory for environment, depending on what your strategy is. So this is where the power of Ansible really comes in. And compared to other platforms, this is just so much more readable. You can add as much space as possible. So if you have 10 tasks and you wanted to just put a couple extra lines of space to signify you're moving on to a different category of tasks, throw in that extra space. Nobody's telling you can't. YAML is very flexible that way. So um, build things that are readable, use good descriptions. It doesn't have to be in English. If English is not your native language, throw in what makes this readable and auditable for you, and try to make things, try to build things with as much common sense and align them to your organization's needs. So really awesome stuff. And it starts out really easy. All right. So I talked about variables a little bit. Variables can get a little bit more complicated than just specific roles. But just like I talked about, variables are written and stored in YAML. We can abstract variables out to files. It's really great that we can have different variables for every specific server. So when I show out more of our strategy for building out Ansible for larger organizations, there's a folder structure that you can maintain, where you have group vars that maybe all of your web servers need to have a similar variable. You don't have to break those down into individual host variables. And then if you wanted to specifically break something out into host variables, like probably like host name or a certain IP address, you can break those out into files for each host, which is very easy to do. So I do want to make note of something, that when we nest our variables, or we nest different attributes in JSON or YAML, we're using dot notation to move forward to nested things. So I'll point that out a little bit later, but it's very easy to misunderstand why you can't access your variable. If you're nesting them, you're probably going to have to figure out what the parent variable is, put a dot next to it, and then put your child variable next to that. But I'll definitely show that off in a second. All right. So this is another playbook. We're going to be running this out. We're going to be running this in a few minutes or in the demo. But I think it's really awesome that we can run not just on remote hosts, but we also can run local hosts. So I'm asking all of you, if you're going to try out Ansible, I'm not asking you to build out a home lab, run this on, God forbid, a network that you don't have permission to run it on, like a work or school network. If you don't have the ability to build out virtual machines right now, still check out Ansible. We can write playbooks like this that you can run locally to just check everything out. So this is an API call. I want to note that I originally wrote a playbook to order Domino's pizza. and I was going to like run it at the top of the class, and then like get pizza in the middle. I thought that was going to be really cool, and then I realized that I live in New Jersey, and Domino's pizza is terrible. And I didn't want to ingest that cardboard. No offense to anybody that likes Domino's. You can like whatever food you like, but I thought just getting a Chuck Norris joke was going to be a little bit simpler, and then everybody can everybody can run this. I'm putting a couple tasks together. So I'm pulling from an API here, and I'm registering. I'm using the register keyword to put the results of this into a variable named results, and then I'm using our debug module to read the variable results, and then I'm using the copy module to put that the results.json.value into a file called cool.txt, because it is very cool. So every module has documentation, and I'm going to show you how to get access to that documentation. But it's all very easy to read and understand. Read the documentation. It's going to all look very similar. As long as you read that documentation, you'll be able to use every single built-in module. So notice here I'm showing off you don't have to use the Ansible.builtin keywords. It works fine just the same. I also want to definitely point out that this only took 2 or 3 minutes to put together. Everybody can read the documentation. I could literally just teach an entire hour class of this is how you use the URI module and this is how you use the debug module. But you guys are smart enough to read that documentation, and I'll point out any kind of tricky things when it comes to that. I also want to point out these double brackets down here, the fancy brackets, if you will. Curly braces, they are officially called curly braces. I call them fancy brackets because I find that hilarious. This is used in a templating language called Jinja. We are not going to talk about Jinja, but when we're printing out variables, we need to use this syntax. So for the copy module specifically, they call out that you need to list your variables this way. So this is a pretty normal thing in Jinja syntax. If you're a web developer with Python, you've probably seen it before in Flask or Django. This is just, there's reasons behind this, but it's still very easy to remember. All right, so one of the really powerful features behind Ansible are Ansible facts. Every time Ansible logs into a machine or runs on your local machine, it's going to gather a large amount of data. So I'm going to demo this out. All of that data gets put into variables that can be queried. So earlier I mentioned, hey, we can just run if a specific specific server is a specific operating system. This is how we accomplish that. So you don't have to like tell everybody this server is Debian, this is CentOS. Ansible's going to figure it out, and we do that with Ansible facts. So if I would say this is probably one of the most powerful features of Ansible, you're going to be able to grab all this information about your servers and query it. I'm going to show all of you how to do that, and it's very, very, very simple to get up on this very quickly.